So, some of you, who came to the lecture last night? Some of this might overlap a little bit, but for those of you who didn't see the sort of work that I made, you have some examples there, but I brought some images to show. No, there you see in the bell jar how I work, and that isn't just an aesthetic thing for a promo shot or anything. I do keep my work in bell jars when I can. I really like that it's you can bump into these and you're really not going to bang into it like you would with a plastic bag around it. So that's something I like to use. I feel like it holds the humidity in there a little bit better. And so when it's getting a little dry, just mist it a bit and then cover it back up. And I find that that's the best way for me to keep the ceramic, the clay in play before it gets fired and is all set to go. So that's how I like to deal with this, so that the details and the amount of work I'm doing to the surface isn't getting interrupted in any way from bumping into it accidentally. So that's what you see there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple processes before I begin. We'll kind of backtrack a little bit to some extent. These pieces, overall, the work is not so much what we're talking about, but the bottom and the top are, because those are pieces that I sculpted, made molds of, and then slip cast them, which is basically pouring liquid clay into a plaster mold. And what happens inside of that mold is that plaster wants all the water, and so it's liquid clay, there's a lot of water in it, and it's pulling all the water out of that slip. And then all you're left with is the clay without the water around the edges. You pour out the excess, and then you get the form that was the cavity inside of the mold. So I wanted to show you a couple in-progress shots of that piece for those of you who didn't see it last night. So these were thrown on the potter's wheel, on an electric potter's wheel. You can see the plastic bats that they're still sitting on there. And I just wanted it to be very regular and precise, so I tooled it down carefully on the wheel and acted more like a machine at that point of this process. So that third part off to the right actually goes on here when it's flipped upside down. So that's the bottom. This is that cap. Look back at this. So that's how I'm assembling it. So I carved this double helix motif around the entire outside of the cap and the base. So there you see the mold. And with complex molds like this was, the two of these molds, one was a 6-part mold and one was a 7-part mold. So a lot of different moving pieces involved in the end. And these are sliding keys. These keys basically lock the mold in place. So if you look at, this is much more simplistic, it's only a 2-part slip cast mold. But on the inside, can everyone see this? I have indentations over here. And then convex keys on this side. So that's essentially what you're getting. It helps lock up the mold in place right where it's supposed to be. And then you reapply your rubber band to hold it together and you pour your slip in. So that's what you're seeing there. And I can go in depth about slip casting a little bit more if you'd like me to. I'll be focusing more on the sprig molding aspect of this process. But here you see the base in progress. And you have to block off each section that you're working on. You have to have enough sides that slide out so that it isn't tearing off the detail of the surface of the form.
Question.
Yes?
You got this negative mold from an original form. What is the material of the original form before you got the plastic mold?
Plastic clay, just regular old water-based clay.
But you formed it yourself?
Yes, I formed that myself. So I started out just with a blob of clay on the potter's wheel, and this was probably 15 or 20 pounds of clay right there, less for this, maybe 8. And I threw them solid and just centered them on the potter's wheel, familiar with that process. And then I took a loop tool once it had gotten a little more stiff And then as it's spinning around, essentially, it was like turning it on a lathe. Just locked my arms in place and carved it away as it spun. So half of the work I was doing, half the work the wheel was doing. So it was all wet clay in the prototype phase. So again, there's the bottom. And then that's what this one mold looked like for the cap before it met its untimely doom. And I really liked how it came out. There was a lot of moving pieces to it that worked correctly. It came apart in a way that made sense.
What kind of mold releaser do you use?
None. None. Because when you're using a plaster mold and slip, you shouldn't have to use anything to release that surface. In fact, that would be a hindrance. If any of that material, that mold release, gets inside of the plaster, it can make it so the plaster can't draw the water out. And then essentially, you're sitting there with a really awkward cup. It doesn't do anything. It's just water sitting in there and it won't go anywhere. So here you see in the foreground we have the prototypes that were used to make the mold, and then those are fresh copies made from it. So the benefit of slip casting, there's a couple different reasons why that's beneficial. It's essentially the printmaking of the ceramics world. You can make duplicates to no end until the mold eventually runs out of its course, but that's going to take a very long time. And also what's happening is clay has a memory. And I'm not sure how much you've looked into this, if you work with ceramic or not, but essentially clay wants to keep doing what it was doing while it was being worked. So that's why sometimes on the potter's wheel, if you're making a bowl and you're pulling out that form, you'll get an S crack in the base of the bowl because it's still wanting to move apart in that same direction in the firing. When you slip cast things, the particles of clay, they don't have a memory of where they were. They stay exactly where they were put. So actually, as far as predictability in the firing, making sure that things don't change while it goes through that magical process in the kiln, slip casting is one of the best ways to go. It's reliable, at least one of the more reliable ways. So that's another reason why I use it. So I like the idea of spending a lot of time working on the piece, and to me it makes sense then to make duplicates of it. I think of Albert Dürer and his, what if his plates weren't plates? What if they were just drawings and each one of those prints was only a single print? I think that we would easily lose it, maybe not appreciate it as much, or not as many people could appreciate it. So I like being able to duplicate that high amount of detail with not having to do the same amount of work over and over again. So the two that you saw in white, those are actually glazed, so that's slip cast porcelain, and they're glazed. I wanted it to have that sanitary look, like a toilet, like a sink. But glaze doesn't always make sense, so for this example I showed last night, it's a little difficult to make out in this projection. It's all spray paint on top of it, and it's that galvanized steel look effect spray paint. So it looks like metal. I wanted it to have a more industrial feel. And in person, I think that this piece accomplishes that. So that's part of what I wanted to talk about with slip casting. And then this is Josiah Wedgwood's baby. It's jasperware. It's the use of bas relief, low relief sprigs on the surface of various forms. So that's what all of these are. You'll have an individual mold for each, and that's largely the process I'll be talking about today, and I'll show you my molds that I use to make things like this. But of course my work thematically does something very different, and it's also a little more simplified from these really elaborate pieces of Wedgwood's jasperware. So there's the work that I do, and again, same process. I have the molds, I apply these sprigs to the surface, and then sometimes I'll also essentially paint on top of that form later on with a brush, and I'll identify that in the demo. So more examples. Here we're seeing sprigs and then some of these tendrils coming off in these locations. Those are actually just painting on with the porcelain on the surface that eventually fuses in. So it has that dichotomy between flatness and texture. And I appreciate that in a tactile way. So some of these are really small, like this round bottom flask on the left. It's that big. So itty bitty, not very large at all. So I'm working on an intimate scale here. So again, what I'm doing with the idea of Wedgwood Jasperware is I'm taking the form and altering it. So when they were once trinket boxes, vases, decorative plates, teacup sets, things that are really benign, I'm turning those vessels into science equipment. Those vessels that are still used today, only glass most of the time. So I'm taking that form and altering it, and then I'm taking the images that are put on top and I'm altering that as well. So in Josiah Wedgwood's Jasperware, which you can look back and see this, on that right-hand piece you have some kind of griffin-like creatures, a Greco-Roman figurine playing a lyre. All of those motifs are really traditional, they're neoclassical. So I'm updating that with things like this, skulls and biohazard symbols. Here on this beaker, that is Yersinia pestis under a microscope, really magnified, I think like 40,000, 400,000 times. So that's what the Black Plague looks like. That wiped out most of Europe during the Middle Ages. Some of these are invented reliefs. So they vary in complexity, and I change up the coloration on them. So this one is the largest of this run of works. This is the 5-liter Erlenmeyer flask, and that comes out to be about that size when it's fired, and it's larger than that when it's still being worked on. That's why I'm able to get a lot more detail in these. I just have more space to work with. The inverse. So some of these I just left blank sprigs. I didn't try to add contrast into their texture. I just leave that up to viewing them in person. But sometimes I try putting different colored slips inside to show you how much texture there really is. Sometimes it can get lost in this game I'm playing between flatness and dimension. So here, and I'll show you a little bit of this when I'm sort of painting with porcelain on the surface. These little dots and some of the tendrils I make are just building up the slip. So it starts with the sprig, and then I work from there to make it a larger piece. Again, this is a reference to Gustav Klimt, his painting Death and Life. I sort of cut off the life side. I really like this image of death. There's something about those colors that really speak to me, which is strange because I don't really use color too much in my work. I just really appreciate it. I don't try to harness it. So I'm referencing that shape that I appreciate so much and kind of making it in my own palette. And I'll show you some molds for that particular sprig. Brought them along. I'll show you the shrinkage process that I go through. And then here, what you see, all this kind of runny texture, I was just playing with the background. That was just watery applications of slip, basically washes. So if you think of making a drawing or painting in an ink and wash style, it's no different at all. So I don't use glaze on any of these pieces. What I do is I put mason stain, which is a type of colorant, a natural colorant, in the clay body itself. So the colors that you see are the porcelain itself. It's porcelain mixed with colorant. So I don't use any kind of glaze over the top. That would be the opposite of what I want. I want a lot of texture and detail. And glaze, even when it's completely see-through, still dulls down that texture and obscures some of the detail of the piece. So I keep them dry, and I'll pass around a piece I brought with me today. This, a little more difficult to make out. I would look at the screen for this one. This is referencing Josiah Wedgwood's black basalt line, where it was black on black. So there's the 5-liter, the larger one, again, more detail there. It's relying solely on light to show you the highlights and create shadow. And I brought a fragment of one of these black basalt pieces because I think that their richness is just something that's difficult to grasp unless you actually are viewing that piece.
So you dyed the clay before you threw this?
Correct. I make the clay, my slip, I make from scratch, all raw ingredients, and I'm have my recipe. I make that, mix that all up, and part of the ingredients are the mason stains that I add in. So from inception, the color is there.
Very cool.
And it's interesting because my blue porcelain looks almost identical to my gray porcelain when I'm working with it, and oftentimes I'm looking at the two, which is which, and it can be tough because they go through such transformation. The black is mostly black all the way through. The blue is more lavender, a light lavender when it's being worked, and then bisque fired it's similar. But then when the blue goes to high fire, take it up to 2300 degrees, it's just blue, really, really blue. So that transformative process of color is interesting to me as well. And I do have more plans to work with the blue line from here on out. I've done a lot of this work and I'm going to continue to do it, but the blue and white, there's more to dig up in that vein of thinking. So here are the anticipatory urns. Sort of repeat myself for those of you who were at the lecture last night, but basically the ideas I'm working with are, what are the life forms that really should be getting our attention and our respect, despite the fact that they're microscopic. We don't know what we're looking at. We aren't aware of the dangers that they pose. We're more aware now, given what's going on with Ebola, and time to time when swine flu, H5N1, the avian bird flu, when those things pop up, then everyone pays attention. But every day, they're a non-issue to most people's mind. We're very caught up in the superficiality of life, myself included. I'm not preaching down in any way. But what I like to do with the work is step back and look at, there are really serious forms of life out there that could be the end of us. We should appreciate the time that we have here now, because if we look at history for reference, there are cycles with extinctions, and our species is not helping itself along at all. So these anticipatory urns are sort of like, hey, you keep playing with different bacteriums and pathogens and you start engineering them, we might be making an adversary that we can't stand against, period. So the urns, they're anticipating death of some sort, mostly because I would figure cremation would be the way of disposing of these bodies that might have been infected by something as malign as Ebola or Yersinia pestis.
Are those urns made by hand or from a mold?
That's made from a mold. So I went through quite a bit of work to even get to the mold process. I bought a piece of Wedgwood. It's supposed to be Wedgwood. It's actually Korean porcelain. It was a knockoff of Wedgwood jasperware, and it was a lamp. So what you had was a marble base to it, the circuitry running up, and then a lampshade on top. It was all white, an exact copy of Wedgwood, which I was almost fooled. And I antique shop for Wedgwood. I really make sure I know the dates, I know all of that, those tells on whether it's a knockoff or not. And when I saw that piece, I thought, this has to be Wedgwood. It turns out it wasn't, but I thought that's close enough. That form is a dead bringer for the original. So what I did was disassemble the whole thing, made a mold of the cap, this part of the body, the neck, and the base. So I don't even remember how many pieces there were to that mold. I cast that copy. I removed all of the decoration that was on it because it was covered in reliefs of neoclassical imagery. I erased all of that, and then I did the entire mold process again. And part of what I'm doing here is I'm shrinking the work. I'm using the nature of clay and how this process moves with firing and all that to shrink things. So if I get really detailed here, when it shrinks down, it's all the more detailed, and I get obsessive about that sort of thing. So you're going to see some OCD tics, no doubt. So I need to reference the drawings because we're going to start that way. These are where all of the sprigs begin with different drawings. These drawings are more elaborate than I'd probably make into a sprig. But the ideas there, all those, I mean, they're tonal drawings now, so it might be hard to figure out, well, where is the volume in it? Where are the massy parts of it? But when it's a line drawing, it's very simple, and I'll show you how. Now we'll stop there and start the demo. I'll have some more images to pull up in a little bit, but we can hit the lights.
What do you teach here? What do you teach here?
Drawing and art appreciation.